The February blizzard that swept across the remote mountains of northern Idaho was the worst Luke Dutch Thornton had seen in his 37 years of working the rugged terrain around Timber Creek. For 3 days, the storm had dumped over 4 feet of snow on his ranch, making it impossible to reach his cattle in the upper pastures and cutting off all access to the small town of Pine Ridge. 20 miles down the mountain, Dutch owned the Whispering Pines Ranch, a modest but well-managed operation that specialized in raising hardy cattle breeds capable of surviving Idaho's brutal winters. He'd inherited the property from his grandfather and had spent most of his adult life living alone in the main ranch house, a sturdy log structure built in the 1920s that could withstand the worst weather the mountains could produce. The isolation didn't bother Dutch, in fact. He preferred it. After a difficult divorce 5 years earlier, he'd found peace in the solitary rhythms of ranch life, where his only companions were his horses, his cattle, and his border collie, Rex. The nearest neighbors were 15 miles away, and Dutch could go weeks without seeing another human being, which suited his increasingly reclusive nature perfectly. On this particular morning, as the storm finally began to subside, Dutch was preparing for the dangerous task of checking on his livestock. The snow was so deep that he'd have to use his snowmobile to reach the areas where his cattle had taken shelter. And even then, he wasn't sure he'd be able to get through the massive drifts that had formed against the natural windbreaks. Dutch was loading emergency supplies onto his snowmobile when Rex began barking frantically, running back and forth between the barn and a grove of pine trees, about 200 yards from the house. The dog's behavior was unusual. Rex was normally calm and focused, not given to excited outbursts without good reason. "What is it, boy?" Dutch called out, but Rex continued his agitated behavior, clearly trying to get his master's attention about something in the trees. Dutch grabbed his binoculars and scanned the area where Rex was focused. At first, he saw nothing but snow-covered trees and the natural landscape of his property. But as he adjusted his focus, he spotted something that made his heart skip a beat. A splash of color that didn't belong in the white wilderness. Partially buried in a snowdrift beneath a large pine tree was what appeared to be a person wearing a bright red jacket. Dutch could see no movement, and the figure was so still and covered with snow that it was clear they'd been there for hours, possibly since the height of the storm. "Jesus," Dutch muttered, immediately starting his snowmobile and racing toward the trees, with Rex running alongside. When Dutch reached the grove, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A young woman, probably in her late 20s, was lying unconscious in the snow, her body positioned as if she'd simply collapsed from exhaustion and cold. She was wearing inappropriate clothing for the brutal weather: jeans, boots, and the red jacket that had caught his attention, but no hat, gloves, or proper winter gear. This rescue story is about to take the most shocking turn you've ever heard. Hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will blow your mind. The woman was barely breathing, her lips blue with hypothermia, and her skin had the waxy appearance of someone in the advanced stages of freezing to death. Dutch had seen enough hunting accidents and winter emergencies to know that she had only minutes to live if he didn't act immediately. Without hesitation, Dutch scooped the woman into his arms and carried her to his snowmobile, wrapping her in the emergency blankets he'd loaded for his cattle-checking expedition. She was completely unconscious and felt dangerously cold to the touch, but Dutch could detect a faint pulse and shallow breathing that indicated she was still alive. The race back to the ranch house was the longest 200 yards of Dutch's life. The woman's condition was so critical that he wasn't sure she'd survive the brief journey. But he pushed his snowmobile as fast as the deep snow would allow, while trying to shield her from the wind and cold. Once inside his house, Dutch immediately began the careful process of treating severe hypothermia, something he'd learned during his years as a volunteer with a local search and rescue team. He knew that warming someone too quickly could cause cardiac arrest, so he moved slowly and methodically. Dutch placed the woman on his couch near the fireplace and began removing her wet clothing, replacing it with warm, dry blankets, while checking her vital signs every few minutes. Her pulse was weak and irregular, her breathing was shallow, and her core body temperature was dangerously low. "Come on," Dutch whispered as he worked to warm her extremities and monitor her condition. "Stay with me. You're safe now." The woman remained unconscious for over an hour while Dutch continued his careful treatment, gradually raising the temperature in the room and providing warm fluids when she was able to swallow. Rex lay nearby, as if sensing the gravity of the situation and wanting to help however he could. It was during this tense period of treatment that Dutch began to notice things about his patient that puzzled him. Despite her inappropriate clothing, an obvious exposure to the elements, she was clearly well cared for and healthy. Her hands showed no signs of rough work. Her hair was professionally styled, despite being matted from the snow, and she was wearing expensive jewelry that seemed inconsistent with someone who would be wandering alone in a blizzard. Most puzzling of all was the complete absence of any identification, purse, or personal belongings. It was as if she'd simply materialized in his pine grove without any of the normal items a person would carry. No wallet, no phone, no keys, nothing that would indicate who she was or how she'd ended up unconscious in a snowstorm. When the woman finally began to show signs of consciousness, Dutch felt a surge of relief mixed with anticipation. He'd saved her life, but he still had no idea who she was or what circumstances had brought her to his remote ranch. "Hey," Dutch said gently, as her eyes began to flutter open. "You're safe. You're in my house, and you're going to be okay." The woman's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, as she tried to process her surroundings. She looked around Dutch's rustic living room, taking in the log walls, the stone fireplace, and the rural furnishings, with an expression of complete bewilderment. Where am I?" she asked weakly, her voice hoarse from cold and dehydration. "You're at my ranch," Dutch replied, offering her a cup of warm tea. "I found you unconscious in the snow. You've been suffering from hypothermia, but you're going to be fine." The woman accepted the tea gratefully, studying Dutch's face with obvious confusion. "I don't. I can't remember." "What's your name?" Dutch asked gently. "Do you remember how you got here?" The woman was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed with concentration as she tried to access memories that seemed to be just out of reach. When she finally spoke, her words would change Dutch's life in ways he could never have imagined. "I'm Sarah," she said slowly, then looked directly into Dutch's eyes, with an expression of recognition and affection that took his breath away. "Sarah Thornton. And you're my husband, Luke." Dutch felt his world tilt as he processed what she'd just said. This woman, this complete stranger he'd rescued from a snowstorm, believed she was his wife. Impossible memories. Dutch stared at the woman calling herself Sarah Thornton, his mind racing as he tried to understand what he was hearing. Seen this woman before in his life. He'd never been married to anyone named Sarah, and his ex-wife's name was Jennifer. Yet this stranger was looking at him with the warm familiarity of someone who'd shared years of intimate companionship. "Sarah," Dutch said carefully, "I think you might be confused. You've been through a serious trauma, and sometimes hypothermia can affect memory and thinking. My name is Luke Thornton, but I'm not married. I've never seen you before today." Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to concern, as if Dutch's words weren't making sense to her. "Luke, what are you talking about? Of course we're married. We've been married for. She paused, her face showing the strain of trying to access memories that seemed frustratingly elusive. "Sarah, I found you unconscious in the snow," Dutch explained gently. "You don't have any identification with you, and you were dressed inappropriately for the weather. Do you remember how you got to my property?" Sarah looked around the living room again, but this time, her expression was different. Instead of bewilderment, she seemed to be recognizing familiar objects and spaces. "This is our house," she said with growing certainty. "That's the chair where you like to read in the evenings. That's the bookshelf where we keep the photo albums. That's the kitchen where we cook dinner together every night." Dutch followed her gaze around his living room, feeling increasingly unsettled by her confident identification of personal details about his life and home. How could a complete stranger know about his reading habits or the layout of his house? "Sarah, I need you to think carefully," Dutch said. "What's the last thing you remember before waking up here?" Sarah closed her eyes and concentrated, her face showing the effort of trying to retrieve memories that seemed to be locked away. "I remember, snow. Lots of snow. I was walking, but I don't remember why. I was cold, so cold, and I couldn't find the house. I kept walking, looking for home, but everything looked the same." "Where were you walking from?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, frustration evident in her voice. "It's like there's a fog in my mind. I remember bits and pieces, but nothing connects properly." Dutch was beginning to suspect that Sarah was suffering from more than just confusion caused by hypothermia. Her symptoms suggested traumatic amnesia, possibly caused by a head injury or severe psychological trauma. But her detailed knowledge of his personal life remained inexplicable. "Sarah, let me call Dr. Martinez in town," Dutch said. "The roads are still blocked from the storm, but maybe we can reach him by radio and get some medical advice." "Dr. Martinez?" Sarah said with immediate recognition. Of course. He's been our family doctor for years. He delivered our double quotes. She paused, pressing her hand to her forehead as if trying to capture a fleeting memory. Dutch felt his blood run cold. Dr. Martinez had indeed been the local doctor for decades, and Dutch had known him since childhood. But how could this woman know about him? Sarah, what were you going to say? He delivered your what? I don't know, Sarah said, clearly distressed by her inability to complete the thought. There's something important I'm forgetting. Something about ... about children. A baby. Dutch's unease was growing by the minute. Sarah's amnesia seemed selective. She remembered details about his life and their supposed relationship, but couldn't recall basic facts about her own identity or how she'd ended up unconscious in a snowstorm. Let me try to reach Dr. Martinez, Dutch said, moving to his radio equipment. But before he could make contact, Sarah spoke again. Luke, the photo albums, she said suddenly. Can we look at our photo albums? Maybe seeing pictures will help me remember. Dutch hesitated. He didn't have any photo albums that would include this woman, and showing her his actual family photos would only prove that she'd never been part of his life. But something about her desperate hope made him reluctant to destroy what might be the only memories giving her comfort. Sarah, the albums might not be what you're expecting, Dutch said carefully. Please, Sarah said, her eyes filling with tears. I feel so lost. If I could just see some pictures of us together, maybe everything would start making sense again. Dutch led Sarah to the bookshelf, where he kept his family photographs. His heart heavy with the knowledge that what she was about to see would shatter her fragile sense of reality. The albums contained pictures of his childhood, his time in the military, his brief marriage to Jennifer, and his years of solitary ranch life. There were no photos of Sarah anywhere. Sarah opened the first album with obvious anticipation, but her expression quickly changed to confusion and distress as she turned through pages of photographs that didn't include her. I don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. Where are the pictures of us? Where are the wedding photos? Where are the pictures of our life together? Dutch sat beside her, feeling helpless in the face of her obvious anguish. Sarah, I think your memories might be confused because of your injury. These are my real photo albums, and I've never been married to anyone named Sarah. But I remember, Sarah insisted, tears streaming down her face. I remember our wedding. I remember moving to this ranch. I remember years of happiness together. How can all of that be wrong? Dutch was beginning to understand that he was dealing with something far more complex than simple amnesia. Sarah's memories weren't just confused, they were impossibly detailed and emotionally authentic. She genuinely believed she'd lived a life with him that had never happened. Sarah, let me ask you something, Dutch said gently. In your memories of our life together, what year did we get married? Sarah thought for a moment. 2018. We got married in 2018. In the spring. May 15th. We had the ceremony at the little church in Pine Ridge, and the reception was here at the ranch. Dutch felt his heart skip a beat. May 15th, 2018 was, indeed, the date he'd planned to marry Jennifer before she'd called off the wedding just 2 weeks beforehand, devastating him and leading to their eventual divorce. How could this stranger know about the most painful day of his life? Sarah, how do you know that date? Because it was our wedding day, Sarah replied with absolute certainty. The most beautiful day of my life. We danced under the stars, and you told me you'd love me forever. Dutch stared at this mysterious woman, who somehow knew intimate details about his cancelled wedding plans. Details that he'd never shared with anyone. Something was happening here that defied rational explanation. And Dutch was beginning to wonder if Sarah's arrival at his ranch was more than just a random accident. As the day wore on, Dutch found himself caught between his rationale, mind, which insisted that Sarah was a stranger suffering from delusions, and a growing emotional connection to this woman who spoke about their life together with such genuine love and conviction. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, and Sarah continued to share memories of their supposed marriage, Dutch made a decision that would change both their lives forever, unraveling the mystery for 3 days. Dutch lived in a strange limbo with the woman who believed she was his wife. Sarah moved through his house with the confidence of someone who'd lived there for years, knowing where everything was located and maintaining a domestic routine that felt both natural and impossible. She cooked meals using recipes, she claimed, they'd developed together, told stories about conversations they'd supposedly had, and demonstrated an intimate knowledge of Dutch's habits and preferences that left him increasingly bewildered. Luke, remember when we painted the bedroom last summer? Sarah said on the third morning as they shared breakfast. You got more paint on yourself than on the walls. And I laughed so hard, I nearly fell off the ladder. Dutch had indeed painted his bedroom the previous summer, working alone and making exactly the kind of mess Sarah described. But he'd done the work in complete solitude. There had been no Sarah, no laughter, no shared moments of domestic happiness. Sarah, Dutch said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In your memories of our life together, are there other people? Friends, family members, neighbors who knew us as a couple? Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. Of course, there's Dr. Martinez, who we see for our annual checkups. There's Pastor Williams at the church, who married us. There's Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store, who always asks about our plans for children. She paused, her expression becoming distant. And there's my sister, Emma. She visits us every Christmas. Dutch felt a chill run through him. Every person Sarah had mentioned was real. Dr. Martinez, Pastor Williams, and Mrs. Henderson were all part of the small community where Dutch had lived his entire adult life. But none of them had ever met Sarah, and Dutch had never been married. In Pastor Williams' church, Sarah, what does your sister Emma look like? She's younger than me, with blonde hair and green eyes. She works as a nurse in Boise, and she's engaged to a man named David, who's in the military. Sarah smiled at the apparent memory. She's always teasing us about when we're going to give her nieces and nephews to spoil. Dutch's blood ran cold. He'd never told Sarah about Jennifer's sister Emma, a blonde nurse from Boise, who was engaged to a soldier named David. These were details from Dutch's actual past, from his relationship with his ex-wife. But somehow, Sarah had incorporated them into her false memories of their marriage. That afternoon, Dutch made a decision that he'd been avoiding since Sarah's arrival. Despite the blocked roads and difficult conditions, he needed to get her to medical professionals who could properly diagnose and treat whatever was causing her condition. More importantly, he needed to contact the authorities to report finding an unidentified woman with apparent amnesia. Using his ham radio, Dutch was able to contact Sheriff Tom Bradley in Pine Ridge and arrange for a helicopter medical evacuation. Once the weather cleared enough for safe flying, Dutch Sheriff Bradley said over the radio, "Can you give me a description of this woman? We've had no missing person reports, but I want to check with other counties." Dutch provided a detailed description of Sarah while she listened from across the room. He could see the growing fear in her eyes as she realized he was arranging to take her away from what she believed was her home. "Luke," Sarah said when he'd finished the radio conversation, "why are you doing this? Why are you acting like you don't know me? Why are you trying to send me away?" "Sarah, because I'm trying to help you," Dutch replied gently. "You need medical attention, and we need to figure out who you really are and how you ended up here." "Know who I am," Sarah said with desperate conviction. "I'm your wife. This is my home. These are my memories, my life, my love for you. How can all of that be wrong?" Dutch found himself torn between compassion for Sarah's obvious distress and his need to uncover the truth about her identity. Over the past 3 days, he'd grown genuinely fond of this mysterious woman, and he had to admit that her presence had filled his house with a warmth and companionship he hadn't realized he'd been missing. That evening, as they waited for the helicopter that would arrive the next morning, Sarah made a confession that would change Dutch's understanding of everything that had happened. "Luke," she said as they sat by the fireplace, "I need to tell you something. Even though I can't remember how I got here or why my memories are confusing everyone, I know that what I feel for you is real." Sarah, ... "No, please, let me finish," Sarah interrupted. "I don't know if I'm really your wife or if my memories are somehow wrong. But I know that when I look at you, I feel loved. When you take care of me, I feel safe. When you speak my name, I feel like I'm home. Whatever the truth is about my identity, my feelings for you are genuine." Dutch looked at this remarkable woman who'd stumbled into his life in the most extraordinary circumstances, and realized that his feelings for her had become equally complicated. Whether or not she was really his wife, whether or not her memories were real, she'd awakened emotions in him that he'd thought were permanently buried. "Sarah, I need to tell you something too," Dutch said. "The wedding date you remember, May 15th, 2018. That was supposed to be my wedding day, but not to you. I was engaged to a woman named Jennifer, and she called off our wedding 2 weeks before the ceremony." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "That's why the date felt so important to me. But Luke, if I'm not your wife, how do I know so much about your life? How do I know about your habits, your house, your friends?" "I don't know," Dutch admitted. But tomorrow, we're going to start finding answers. The helicopter arrived early. The next morning, piloted by medics, who were prepared to transport Sarah to the regional medical center in Coeur d'Alene. As Dutch helped her prepare for the journey, both of them understood that whatever happened next would determine not just Sarah's identity, but the future of the unexpected connection that had developed between them. "Luke," Sarah said, as they waited for the medical team to finish their preparations, "promise me something. Promise me that if we find out I'm not really your wife, you won't forget these few days we've had together. Don't forget that we were happy, even if it was built on impossible memories." "I promise," Dutch said, and meant it. "And Sarah, promise me that you'll fight to recover your real memories, even if they're different from what you believe now. You deserve to know who you really are." As the helicopter lifted off from Dutch's ranch, carrying Sarah toward answers that might shatter everything she believed about herself, Dutch stood in his yard feeling more alone than he had since his divorce. The woman who'd claimed to be his wife was gone, but she'd left behind questions that would haunt him until they were answered. What Dutch didn't know was that the truth about Sarah's identity would prove to be more extraordinary than either of them could have imagined. That their story was far from over. The truth about Sarah. 3 days after Sarah's helicopter evacuation, Dutch received a phone call that would answer all his questions, while raising new ones that challenged everything he thought he understood about fate, memory, and love. "Mr. Thornton," said Dr. Rebecca Chen, the neurologist treating Sarah at the medical center, "I'm calling with some very unusual news about your friend Sarah. We've identified her, and her story is quite remarkable." Dutch gripped the phone tighter. "Who is she, doctor?" "Her real name is Sarah Elizabeth Manning. She's 29 years old, from Seattle, and until 4 days ago, she was engaged to be married to a man named Robert Collins." Dutch felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that Sarah's identity had been discovered, but disappointment that her memories of being his wife were definitively false. "What happened to her? How did she end up at my ranch?" Dr. Chen paused before answering. "Mr. Thornton, Sarah was in a car accident on Highway 95, about 30 miles from your property. She and her fiancés were driving to a ski resort when they hit black ice and went off the road. Robert was killed instantly, and Sarah suffered a severe head injury that caused both amnesia and what we call confabulation." Confabulation, it's a condition where the brain creates false memories to fill in gaps caused by injury. But what makes Sarah's case extraordinary is the specificity and consistency of her false memories about you and your supposed marriage. Dutch was quiet as he processed this information. Sarah had lost her fiancé in a tragic accident, and her brain had somehow created an entire alternate reality, where she was married to a stranger. "Dr. Chen, how could her brain create such detailed memories about my life? She knew things about me that she couldn't possibly have known. That's what makes this case so unusual," Dr. Chen replied. "We've done extensive testing, and we believe Sarah may have experienced what's called cryptomnesia, unconsciously absorbed information about you from some unknown source and incorporated it into her confabulated memories." "What kind of source?" "We're not sure. Perhaps she'd heard about you from someone, read about you somewhere, or encountered information about your life in ways she doesn't consciously remember. Her brain then used that information to construct false memories that felt completely real to her." Dr. Chen continued with more details about Sarah's condition and treatment. But Dutch found himself thinking about the woman who'd spent 3 days believing she was his wife, creating moments of domestic happiness that had felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years. "Doctor, how is Sarah handling the news about her real identity?" "That's complicated," Dr. Chen replied. "She's devastated about Robert's death, of course, but she's also struggling with the loss of her memories about you. Even though we've explained that those memories were false, they felt completely genuine to her, and losing them is like losing a relationship that was very important to her." "Can I see her? She's asked about you several times. I think a visit might be helpful for both of you, as long as you understand that she's dealing with grief for both her fiancé and the imaginary life she believed she had with you." Dutch drove to Coeur d'Alene the next day, his emotions a complex mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting with Sarah, the woman who'd claimed to be his wife, but was actually a stranger dealing with tragedy and loss. He found Sarah in the hospital's garden area, sitting on a bench and staring out at the lake. She looked smaller and more fragile than he remembered, but when she saw him approaching, her face lit up with a smile that was both happy and heartbroken. "Luke," she said softly, "I was hoping you'd come. How are you feeling?" "Sarah lost," she replied honestly. They've told me about Robert, about the accident, about my real life. I remember most of it. Now my job, my family, my relationship with Robert, but I also remember our 3 days together, and those memories feel just as real. Dutch sat beside her on the bench. Sarah, I need you to know that even though our marriage was a creation of your injured brain, the time we spent together was real for me too. You brought something into my life that I didn't know I was missing. What was that? Hope, Dutch said simply. Hope that I could be happy again, that I could share my life with someone, that love was still possible for me. Sarah turned to face him fully. Luke, I have something I need to tell you. When my real memories came back, I remembered something that the doctors say might explain how my brain knew so much about you. Dutch waited for her to continue. 6 months ago, I was working on a freelance writing project about rural life in America. I interviewed dozens of ranchers and farmers, and I remember now that one of them mentioned you specifically. They told me about the successful bachelor rancher in Idaho, who'd never remarried after his divorce, who lived alone on a beautiful property and devoted his life to his animals. Who was it? I can't remember exactly, but they described your house, your habits, even your dog, Rex. They painted such a vivid picture of your life that when my brain was creating false memories, it used that information to build our imaginary relationship. Dutch felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Sarah's brain had constructed their fictional marriage using real information about his life, which explained the uncanny accuracy of her false memories. Sarah, knowing that explanation doesn't change how I feel about what we shared, Dutch said. You made me realize that I want to share my life with someone. You showed me what happiness could feel like. And you showed me what it felt like to be truly loved and cared for, Sarah replied. Even though our marriage was imaginary, the way you treated me, the kindness, the protection, the genuine affection that was real. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of them processing the complex emotions surrounding their brief but meaningful relationship. What happens now? Dutch asked finally. I go back to Seattle, back to my real life, Sarah said. I have a funeral to plan, a life to rebuild, grief to process. And you go back to your ranch, back to your solitude. Does it have to be that way? Sarah looked at him with surprise. What do you mean? I mean that even though our marriage was false, our connection was real. Even though your memories were created by trauma, our feelings were genuine. Maybe we could try building something real, something based on truth instead of confabulation. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Luke, I don't know if I'm ready for that. I need time to grieve Robert, to heal from this whole experience. My brain created a love story with you to escape from tragedy, and I need to make sure that any feelings I have now are genuine, and not just extensions of that escape. I understand, Dutch said. But Sarah, I also want you to know that I'll wait. For the first time in years, I've found someone worth waiting for. 6 months later, Dutch received a letter from Sarah postmarked from Seattle. She'd spent the time in grief counseling, rebuilding her real memories, and slowly healing from both the accident and the loss of her fiancé. But she'd also been thinking about the rancher who'd saved her life, and shown her a kind of love she'd never experienced before. Dear Luke, the letter began, I'm ready to try building something real with you, if you're still interested, not based on false memories or brain injuries, but on genuine affection between two people who found each other in the most extraordinary circumstances. Would you like to start over, the right way this time? Dutch smiled as he read the letter, then walked to his desk to write a response. Rex followed him, as if sensing that something important was happening. Dear Sarah, Dutch wrote, I've been waiting for this letter every day since you left. Yes, I'd like to start over, the right way this time, and I think I'd like to start by asking you on a proper first date one, where we both know who we really are. 1 year later, Dutch and Sarah were married in the little church in Pine Ridge on May 15th, the same date that had featured in Sarah's false memories. But this time, the ceremony was real, witnessed by their families and friends who understood that their love story had grown from impossible circumstances into something genuine and lasting. As they danced at their reception on Dutch's ranch, Sarah whispered in his ear, You know, what's funny? My brain created memories of dancing with you under the stars, and now we're actually doing it. The difference is, Dutch replied, this time it's real, and this time it's forever. Their story became legendary in the small community of Pine Ridge, the tale of a rancher who found a woman frozen in the snow, and how her impossible memories of a love that never existed became the foundation for a love that would last a lifetime. If this incredible story about love, memory, and second chances moved your heart, Smash that like button and subscribe for more amazing true stories about how fate brings people together in the most unexpected ways. Share this video with someone who believes that love can bloom even from the most impossible circumstances. Comment below and tell us, do you believe in destiny or coincidence? Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring stories. Remember, sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the mind understands why. This remarkable story reminds us that love can emerge from the most extraordinary circumstances, even when those circumstances seem to defy logic and reason. Sarah's false memories of a marriage that never existed became the blueprint for a real relationship built on genuine care, understanding, and affection. Dutch and Sarah's journey from strangers to soulmates proves that sometimes the most meaningful connections begin with impossible situations that force us to examine what we really want from life and love. Their story shows us that while memories can be false, feelings can be genuine, and that the heart often recognizes what it needs, even when the mind is confused. Their love story continues to inspire others who have found themselves starting over after loss, proving that second chances at happiness are possible even after the most devastating circumstances, and that sometimes the most beautiful relationships grow from the ashes of tragedy and the seeds of hope.